This is a great locomotive that has been well engineered and produced by Hornby. A big hello to you, welcome back to the channel. I'm Jennifer Kirk, welcoming you up here to the loft on Weir Yard. Now it is really hot today, so do bear with me if I start to look a little red. It's not just because I've been looking at that strange golden orb that has appeared in the sky above northern England. It is really a little bit hot and stuffy, and that's because most UK homes don't have air conditioning. But you didn't come here to listen to my heat-related woes. You came about the Hornby A2 that Hornby Hobbies have very kindly sent over to the channel to be put through its full paces up here on Weir Yard. Now the A2 is a peculiar class of locomotives, and originally I'd known of them as the Peppercorn A2. And I was quite surprised to find out that they were only the final 15 built to a slightly modified design by Thompson's successor. Now, Edward Thompson was a CME for the LNER who took over from Gresley during Second World War conditions, and in some respects a lot of his designs have kind of got squeezed between two slightly more famous CMEs. But actually he brought standardization, and the Thompson A2 was probably his crowning achievement. Indeed, he retired before the final few were delivered, and he was honoured by having the very first of the class named after him in a break from LNER condition. Now, Sun Castle here, which is the example that Hornby have sent over, isn't named after a medieval building. It's actually named after a thoroughbred racehorse of the time in the 1940s. And it's something that I found out only recently, that thoroughbred racehorses all have to have unique names. No two ever carry the same name. And it's a bit like actors with equity in that way. So that's why you get some of these rather strange racehorse monikers. And Sun Castle was no different in that respect. Now the LNER did go into naming some of their top express locomotives after racehorses. The A2s did this, and indeed the tradition was carried over into the Class 55 Deltics, with some of their number being named after some of the greats of the day like St Paddy, Meld and Ballymoss. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Today's video comes in association with Trainomatic, makers of DCC decoders and accessories that are designed by enthusiasts for enthusiasts. Find the full range available to order now at tramfabrique.co.uk. Additional support for today's video comes from All Mouse Media, publisher of books and graphics novels, which can be found at the link down below. Check them out today, including the amazing Stars books. But without further ado, we're going to be taking a good look at this Hornby A2 locomotive, and we will be doing a full DCC fitting guide using the Trainomatic 8-pin decoder. Stay tuned for that in the final third of today's video, if that's what you've come for, and let's see, did it really live up to the legacy of its thoroughbred namesake? The A2 class of locomotives on the LNER have quite an interesting history. Now, the initial A2s were rebuilt from the 282P2 class, and with a few detailed differences, the A2 subsection 3 class were then built from scratch using a lot of the experience gained with those P2 rebuilds. Now, Thompson was a great fan of standardization, but it's quite interesting that these were his final hurrah as a locomotive designer. He took over quite late from Sir Nigel Gresley upon his death in 1941, and indeed these locomotives were being delivered just as Thompson was retiring. The first of the A2s were actually named after Edward Thompson, but it was left to his successor, Peppercorn, to be able to iron out the wrinkles. And it's quite interesting that the Peppercorn A2s had a number of detail differences, including the banjo-style dome, which then, to confuse things later on in life, some of the A2s that were built under Thompson actually gained the banjo-style dome when the boilers were swapped at works visits, and actually they were fairly interchangeable. And so this locomotive here sports the Peppercorn style dome, even though it is in fact a Thompson built A2. I'd like to thank Hornby for sending over this model for review, and it's one of a number that were recently released to the range. So we've got a number R3835, this is the late BR Thompson class A2/3, 462 Pacific class, and this is Sun Castle number 60523. And what I do like about this newer style packaging from Hornby is it's really neat. I've said this before, it does show the model at its best with a picture on the front, so you know exactly what you're getting, rather than peering through plastic packaging and a plastic window to try and deduce what this model is going to look like. On the back of the slipcase as well, we get the potted history of the class, and then a little paragraph here with a very specific history of the model that's in the box. So this little bit will vary between different members of the class that are released in model form. It's again fairly standard Hornby box, so we don't need to dwell on it at all. I'm just going to get this out, and we do get some detail parts in here as well. Some of the brake rigging, some front detail parts. I think they're front steps. We've also got the drain cock pipes as well, and I will warn you with these that unless you've got incredibly gentle curves, they will foul the front bogie. So if it's going in a display cabinet or being run on, say, an end-to-end layout where it doesn't have to traverse some quite tight curves, you can fit these. Otherwise, I'd leave them in the detailing pack. Now, just to be clear, when it did come out, there's some of the detail. I've got this here. This was loose in the box, but it's actually, I think some of this detail, Hornby does make a little bit of a rod for its back, because there's only a little bit of glue that holds this in place, and it is quite an easy fix. So I'm going to put that back in the box for now, but I will show you where that has come from, and it's not really a big deal. The locomotive itself really does have a great presence to it, and the tender too is quite reminiscent of the A4s, again from the same stable. So I've got one of the A4s. I just wanted to check just how similar these tenders are. Now this one's a little bit dusty, so that's why it appears a slightly lighter colour. But the basic design of the non-corridor tenders that come with the A4s is pretty much the same. But the A4s have this flush side, seen here on Guillemot, and the A2s have this much more riveted construction, which Hornby has captured really nicely on the side. All of those rivets, the way they're put together, and I guess it was much easier to construct the tenders this way, and certainly both the A1s and the A2s seem to favour this riveted construction, although they are pretty much, as far as I can tell, mostly the same tender designs. The tender and locomotive come semi-permanently coupled together, and you can see here again it's a mechanism that I do quite like, because it doesn't risk the locomotive and tender coming undone on the track, and you end up pulling the full weight of the train around just by these wires that go to the tender plug, which would otherwise be potentially quite damaging, and they are a nuisance to repair if they pull apart. So I do like this tender drawbar, and it also comes with two different positions you can put it in here. It's simply a case of undoing that screw, and there's a second hole there that you can then fit it through, which moves the tender forward so you get a closer coupling between the two. But unless you've got quite gentle curves on your layout, or it's going in a display cabinet, then I would suggest probably best to leave it with the standard distance between locomotive and tender. The rest of the detail on this model is captured really well. We've got these posable roof vents as well, so we've got there closed, and just slide them back, open, and this is one of the features that I've seen on a lot of Hornby locomotives. It's a nice touch. It does mean that you can pose these in whichever way you wish. A lot of flexibility, and they are actually a lot more robust than you might think for something that is just actually a tiny plastic insert. The interior of the cab is fully detailed. You can see there we've got those bucket seats which were a staple of the LNER, very reminiscent of the A4s, but of course a lot of other locomotives got them too. The back head detail is all there and nicely printed out. There is a little bit of additional detail parts added in there in terms of the brass turncocks there just on some of the boiler work. There's no actual dials on the face of the steam gauges there. They just appear to be a tampo dabbed finish with white. It's not quite as fancy as we've seen on some earlier releases, but I did really think that some of the additional details, such as those dials phrases that you could pretty much see all of the markings on and the needles, was detail for detail's sake. Obviously makes it a little bit more difficult for tampo printing in the factory, so if it's something that does try and keep the price down, then it can only be applauded. The front face of the locomotive really does capture the business-like front end of these LNER workhorses well. With the smoke deflectors on there, it does very much have a look of the possibly more famous A1 class, but certainly the A2 was definitely a machine that packed a punch. The valve gear is fluted and made of metal, very robust, and the full mechanism does work flawlessly on the track. We've also got additional detail in terms of the rod there that connects the forward and reverse gear in the cab to the valve mechanism, and it's not just a piece of bent metal, it does have etched detail into it to really bring it alive, and it's not finished in bright shiny metal, but it's got this slight blackening too, which does make it really look the part. The speedometer drive is quite slender there, and it all comes factory fitted. There's actually very little detail for the end user to apply, which I do quite like. I really do hate having to fiddle about. Now, we mentioned that piece of detailing that had come adrift in the box. You can see there's this one there, and it's only held on by two little bits glued in place. The other one came from this side, and I will glue it back with some super glue very carefully later on, but it's only honesty to point out that that had come adrift in transit. The full plate between the locomotive and tender is posable, and it's this kind of brass checker plate effect, and it does look quite good. In the furthest apart position there is a gap, but I believe that if you move the tender forward to that second position, then that gap will disappear and you'll get a much more prototypical look between the two. Looking underneath, the front bogie is correctly sprung in the centre, and again this really does improve the look of this locomotive when it's running, and I much prefer this that Hornby introduced on all of its top-link locomotives across their range, replacing that rear pivoted bogie effect, which had this habit of swinging right out. This instead makes the locomotive look much more prototypical, going through curves and point work. The front end of this model shows just how much die-cast metal is in use. There's a lot of weight, and that in turn really does build and add to the traction that the locomotive has and the amount that it can pull, and we're going to put it through its paces on wear yard later on in this review. The safety valve covers are separately fitted turned brass pieces, and they really do look quite fine. I do like them. They are a feature that does stand out, and it's always nice with these very prominent features that they are done right. The whistle is a plastic moulding. It is painted to match the turned metal safety valve covers, but there is just a little bit of a seam at the bottom and at the side, but the colour match is really, really good, and actually you have to get very, very close to see any of that seam, which is only slightly perceptible. The handrails on the boiler, again, separately applied. We've got pipework and then we've got metal handrails. These are robust. They're exactly where they need to be, and they do look really good. There's no problems whatsoever with anything loose on this model down the side of the boiler, and we get all of this fabulous detail across the running plate too. Now, the running plate itself is plastic, but the chassis inside this top is all metal, so it really does work quite well in terms of using the different materials to great effect. The smoke deflectors too, they feel like they might be plastic. I think they are plastic, but again, they do look good. The boiler too it feels like plastic. I think all of the ballast weight in this model is below the running plate, but certainly there's no issues with that. The nameplates on this model are printed to the smoke deflectors. You can see there the Sun Castle. They do look absolutely right, and I see no problem with this printed nameplate. There aren't any etched ones to apply over the top. If you want to go down the route of replacing these, there are a number of aftermarket suppliers that do them, but my honest opinion is that the printing on these nameplates is good enough that it just isn't required. The buffers are fully sprung, turned metal, and again, well fitted. There's no looseness to those, and they fit into that heavily riveted front buffer beam, which is picked out in the correct shade of red and really does look substantial on this model. We've got a separately fitted wire detail smoke box dart there, and it does also look like, actually I don't think it is a separately applied smoke box number plate, but it is very, very fine, and it actually had me fooled into thinking that it was separately applied until I looked really, really close. It does work quite well. We've got the number printed very, very clearly, 60523, and the 36A shed code at the bottom. The dish of the smoke box door is again captured really, really well. It doesn't appear to be opening, but I always find that a bit of a gimmick, so it doesn't bother me in the slightest that it doesn't open. The double chimney is very, very big and very, very distinctive on this model. It's been captured really well. The entire chimney does sit properly. There's no gaps or anything. Not sure whether that's a separately fitted part or part of the same moulding, but certainly it has worked out really, really well. Now, what I thought might have been a parting line in the mould is actually the split between the boiler cladding panels, so that is entirely prototypical along the top of the boiler. And just to emphasise that it's not a mould parting line, the smoke box doesn't have the same, because on the real locomotive it was built as a rolled steel plate, and there just wasn't a seam at the top, and that is faithfully reproduced on this model. The banjo dome, which you can see here, it's almost this streamlined effect, is again very distinctive on this type of boiler, and it does place this locomotive towards the last few years of its life after it received a boiler swap, and that would have corresponded most likely with it also receiving the later BR crest. If we look on the tender, that is crisp and incredibly sharp. The detail on the lion, the crown and the wheel really is second to none. It's not just a suggestion in red with a gold coloured crown underneath and a white wheel. There are some quite subtle highlights and lowlights on that, and it really does reward careful viewing. The lining is straight and true. You see it there on the tender. Really does sit exactly where it needs to be. The tender itself is 8-wheeled, and these feature the centre mounting, as you can see there, exactly the same design as the A4 Pacific tender. The power is bridged across by this standard plug which just goes in there, and then we appear to have wiper pickups, certainly on the first axle and the final axle, to add to the electrical pickup from all 6 of the driving wheels, and that does mean that this locomotive is quite a sure-footed performer on the track because it is picking up over quite a long wheelbase. The top of the tender, the coal load, that is a really good rendition of coal. I'm just feeling there, I think it is a plastic insert. It is possible to very gently lever this out, and it does seem to be quite well in place. That is a good tight fitting load. In fact, I'm not going to try and lever that all the way out. If you want to have your model featuring an empty bunker, or indeed remove that and refill with real coal up to the level that you want, you can do. The provision is there. We've also got the top of the water scoop, the water filler at the back, and we've also got this divider here, which would mean that you could actually load this with coal right up to the top. So that would then stop the coal from sliding back and just swamping the water filler. It would also make sure that the tender didn't become overloaded. If you have too much coal over the top of the water tank, it would affect the axle loading. So there is plenty of scope even with this. If you want to model it with quite a full tender, you can put a dusting of coal over the top of all that. That is actually a very, very fine piece. It feels like metal. I don't know whether it is, but it's certainly well and truly fixed in place, and certainly it was an issue with, I believe, the K1 class locomotives from Hornby, that these tender dividers did have a habit of coming loose, but there's no such problem with this. Looking to the rear of the locomotive, because this is the later period BR, we've got those overhead warning flashes. Again, really sharp, crisp and clear. All the rivet detail on the back. The handrails separately applied, and I do like these foot boards here for the crew to climb up to gain access to the top of the tender for when they're filling it with water. The vacuum pipes come factory fitted, and again the rear buffers are sprung too. The coupling is a slimline tension lock which just fits into the pocket at the back. Really easy to swap these over for any other type of coupling that you might want. Looking to the front of the locomotive, I don't see any fitting for a front coupling, but quite frankly, these locomotives would have pretty much always been turned on a turntable, and so it's quite probable that they would never have pulled a train in reverse. So actually that works quite well for me, and it means you don't have an ugly gaping hole. I also like that we've got quite a lot of metal construction in this front bogie. These guard irons really are quite strong, verging on sharp actually. Really nice. It does give more low down weight, and you can see the detail there on the riveting. It really does work well. The wheels, metal tired, and we've also got these blackened middles. The tyres too have got an element of chemical blackening, it does seem, and everything that you see here is just as it should be. Now, all of the Pacific locomotives from Hornby, and that includes the Princess Coronations, the Duchesses, the A4s and these A2s, also feature these fixed rear pony trucks, and then we've got this flangeless wheel inside. Hornby used to provide a flanged wheel to go in there as well, but so few people use them, it's been cut out as another means to try and keep the cost down. But if you do wish to switch this out for a flanged version, it's quite easy to undo the single screw and swap over the wheel. Now, some people have criticised this arrangement, but when you compare it to the earlier Hornby models, where it actually had a flanged wheel and a moving rear pony truck, you got an unprototypical gap where you could see through above, and actually This makes the locomotive look really, really prototypical, and because of the flangeless wheels, there's no risk of derailments on that. It just swings out when it goes round corners and then swings back onto the track. If that's something that bothers you, what I have to say about that is, would you rather you had a pony truck that really never looked the part, or a pony truck that looks the part unless you try and run this round what is, quite frankly, very unprototypically radius 1 or 2 curves, although I believe the model is recommended for a minimum of radius 2. For DCC fitting, all you're going to need is a jeweler's screwdriver. We're going to carefully turn the locomotive over, and we're just going to focus on the tender. It looks to be that the screw that holds it together is hidden underneath the NEM coupling. So a large flathead jeweler's screwdriver, and I always press my thumb down to stop the coupling from flexing and breaking. Just lever that out, and you can see there is the screw that holds the tender body on. So we're just going to unscrew that, turn the whole thing over, and the whole tender body now unclips. We've got a clip at the front and that single screw at the back, and you can see inside there is a lot of room for anything that you want. And of course, these models also come pre-set up for a TTS sound decoder to go in, and I believe that Hornby, if they don't already have one in the range, this is quite clear that it is planned to be future-proofed. We've got this metal weight. If you are doing a sound fit, the circular speaker fits underneath here. You just need to take the metal plate off, fit the speaker in, run the wires through, and then screw this back down. As we're just going for a plain DCC decoder fit, it's really, really easy. So let's get the decoder out and ready, and then again with our large flathead screwdriver, gently ease the blanking plate both sides. Don't just yank it from one side because you'll bend all the pins. And we just take that out. And then we've got the handy arrow there that tells us exactly where pin 1 is. On the DCC decoder, just look for the orange wire. That orange wire is always pin 1. So very carefully now, line up the pins, make sure it's square, and then a gentle downward pressure, and you'll feel the plug just slide into place. So just firm, but you don't need excessive force. As we're just using a plain DCC decoder here, all I'm going to do with this is just tuck it neatly into the space that's actually reserved for the sound decoder speaker, and that just keeps everything nice and neat. You want to make sure that none of these wires foul either the screw, because that screw will chew them apart and cause mystery shorts, or indeed get stuck underneath the body side, which will just prevent it from seating and look a little bit silly. There's lots of space underneath here, so really all we have to do now is clip that in, lower down the back, and then again with my rather grubby jeweler's screwdriver, get the screw in. Don't over tighten it, and you can see there, just make sure that the whole of the tender body is sitting nice and flat. And then all we need then, make sure you've got the coupling the right way up, fit it to the NEM pocket, and just slide it back into place. The locomotive is now DCC fitted. As a DCC decoder address number 3 is standard, we can move it to the programming track, program it up as we need to, and it's all ready to run on Weir Yard. When it comes to running, the model performed really well. There's a good deal of weight right where it needs it over those driving wheels, and that in turn allowed this model to pull a reasonable length train without any real sign of wheel slip, including up and down some challenging gradients here on Weir Yard. The flangeless rear pony truck wheels also help it to negotiate even down to some quite unprototypically tight curves, and at the same time allowing this rear pony truck to hug the body. It's not hinged, it's kind of false, but it does look the part, and that really is important. The flangeless wheels just helping it to perform. It will mean that on some very tight corners you will see the back end of this locomotive kind of hang out over the track, but I think that that's a compromise well worth taking. Through the pointwork and curves, this fully prototypically accurate sprung front bogie really does make this locomotive look graceful, whilst at the same time hugging the track, just like its namesake would have done back in the 1940s. On extended running, I did find that the tender could very occasionally have a propensity to derail on my scissors crossing, and I wasn't really quite able to get to the bottom of that. One thing to be noted is that the tender is comparatively quite light compared to the locomotive, and that may have had some small bearing on that. But it was minor, and as those who watched the Monday Club a couple of weeks ago would have seen, it only happened twice within a 2-hour period, so I suppose that that is perfectly well acceptable, and you could argue that my track may well have been as much at fault as the tender on this locomotive. All in all, running performance was really good. I was also pleased to see that once DCC fitted, there was no need to change any of the CVs. Out of the box, the locomotive performed naturally with this Trainomatic 8-pin decoder, and it had some quite slow speed running control, which I was pleased to see. Slow speed running control of the locomotive as a whole was very, very acceptable, and across the board this locomotive performed well. So we turn now to the scores. First up is build quality, and the locomotive has withstood my heavy handling really, really well. I've got some quite hot sweaty fingers in this hot weather, and you might see some of the little fingerprint marks that are appearing on the model. In times gone by, I used to have to wear white gloves when handling models from the Hornby 00 stable because sweat really did attack some of the lining and transfers. Well, the days of transfers are happily long gone, but my sweat didn't manage to lift a single bit of the decoration on this model, and that's good enough for me. The only area where I even had a small problem was one of the cab side doors. It's really, really fine and only held on by the tiniest dab of what appears to be super glue, and unfortunately that wasn't enough to protect it in transit, but really that is the only piece of detail that succumbed to my heavy handling. So overall, pretty good performance, and I'm going to give it a 9.2. On running quality, again, as you saw, it did perform pretty well, hauling all that was asked of it and being quite graceful through the curves and double slips and other assorted point work. On the gradients, it performed well. The only area where it had even the smallest of issues was the tender, just derailing quite occasionally, and I struggled to capture it on camera during filming of the review, but as said before, on the Monday Club it was visible maybe twice in 2 hours. So it's the only area that I can particularly fault this model, so I'm going to give it a 9.1. On Dcc Fitting and Innovation, the Dcc Fit is really simple. The tender is quite spacious, and I was able to fit in that decoder without any issue whatsoever. There's even space natively for a sound decoder within this tender, with the mounting point for the speaker, and that really does make things very, very easy for the modeler that wants to fit these things themselves. The only area where I felt that it was lacking a little bit is that there's no firebox glow, and I'm really splitting hairs here, but in recent years we've seen a plethora of locomotives come through with the firebox glow coming in as standard, and I guess that the A2 may well have been the final locomotive designed before that became standard. Even so, it's a shame that it doesn't appear on this model. I would love to see more use of DCC functionality, and on steam locomotives there are a number of areas where this can be put to good use, including that firebox flicker, and unfortunately this model doesn't feature that. In all other areas it really was great, and it cannot be spoken more highly of how easy that DCC fit is. So I'm going to give this an 8.9. On accuracy and quality of finish, there really is nothing major to note. I didn't really see anything that particularly strayed from what a Thompson A2 really should look like. One area which I always do notice though are these wind deflectors on the sides of the cabs. They do look a little bit strange in that completely clear plastic, and for me they were probably the only major area to pick up on and go, that just slightly takes something away from the otherwise perfect look of the rest of the model. So I'm going to give this a 9.9. When it comes to value for money, the locomotive's RRP is sizably above the £200 mark, and that's just for the DCC Ready version. It has to be said that a number of different manufacturers are now releasing models in the above £200 bracket, and it does appear to be becoming the norm. It's complicated, the reasons for this, and it really shouldn't be just Hornby that gets singled out to be pointed out that they're doing this. It is unfortunately a sign of the times. Cheap manufacturing from the Far East is something that is very firmly stuck in the last decade, and unfortunately this is just how things are. Each of these models contains probably in excess of 100 separately fitted parts, and they have to be hand assembled. And, well, it's just a fact of life that you have to pay for that. It costs money, and you cannot begrudge the workers that are doing that, some very skilled workers, the right to earn a decent wage doing it. Looking around online, we're able to find it at discounted prices, and certainly we've included a link down below to Hattons, who are the retailer that we're supporting today, with our referred link, and you can find Suncastle and all of her available stablemates in a variety of different liveries there. So all in all, I'm going to give 8.0 for the value for money. So overall that gives us a final score of 45.1, a very respectable score for what is a superb locomotive that has been well engineered and produced by Hornby. And again, I would like to extend my thanks to Hornby for very kindly sending over this model for review. Well, I hope you really enjoyed today's video and found it informative, and today we've got a link for you down in the description box, and we'll be supporting Hattons model railways with this. Check out the link to find the full range of the Thompson A2s from Hornby in both the BR liveries and that very fetching LNER versions too, so check them out today at the link down below. And I'd also love to hear from you in the comments section. Is this a model that you have? What are your thoughts on it, and is there anything that you think that I may have missed in today's video? Don't forget as well that you can head on over to Patreon and help support the channel to make the videos that you want to see, and the Monday Club wagon is still available to order at the link in the description box, but hurry because stocks are running low, and this is sure to be an item to treasure for years to come, as well as providing much needed brick traffic for William Loud & Sons on your model layout. But until next time, this is me, Jenny Kirk, saying you take great care of yourself. Happy modelling, and stay safe in this heat. Take care, bye for now. Today's video comes in association with Trainomatic, makers of DCC decoders and accessories that are designed by enthusiasts for enthusiasts. Find the full range available to order now at tramfabrique.co.uk. Additional support for today's video comes from All Mouse Media, publisher of books and graphics novels, which can be found at the link down below. Check them out today, including the amazing Stars books. I'd like to send out a huge thanks to everybody who supports me on Patreon, and an extra special huge thanks goes out to Anthony Kidson, Offshore Allen, Michael Lockie, Helen Sink, Gary Lewis, David Quinn, Sparky107107, George Botterini, Chris Moss, Robert Steers, Sam Yates, Dale Williams, John N from NC, NYMRish, Jonathan Foster, Peter, Clifford Ison, Larry W. Grant, NI Railways 4000 class, Ian Coulson, Alan Dickerson, Eddie Popper, Karen Nichol, Medwin Williams, Crossways Point Junction, 3B Rail, and Jennifer Garrett. Thank you. Without you guys, I couldn't do this.